Good afternoon. Welcome to the second in our winter series, which is entitled provocatively, "What's Justice Got to Do with It?" And we've got 4 more cafes in line, and I might remind you of those. 2 weeks from today, on the 18th of February, we're going to have a talk by someone who works with NPR, National Public Radio in Chicago, Steve Bynum, and talk about justice and the media. And then we're going to have, on the 3rd of March, 2 weeks after that, a cafe on justice and religious freedom. Then, just to warn you in advance, I'll keep reminding you of this, after the 3rd of March, we're going to take a 3-week break rather than the usual 2-week break. Come back with, on the 24th of March, with one on justice and war, and then the very following week, we'll talk about justice and future generations, and that will be the end of the winter series. So today, I'm very happy to introduce to you Professor Thomas Keating of the Department of Political Science at the university. Professor Keating is interested in Canadian foreign and defense policy, in international ethics, and in interventions in state sovereignty, which is a very hot topic right now with the problems in Libya and Syria. So we're going to proceed as usual. Maybe I should go over that again in case there are new people here. Our animateur, Professor Keating, will talk for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll just throw it open to discussion, and that will continue on until 2:15, 2:30, something like that. We'll take a break so that you can refresh your drinks, and then have a concluding half hour or 40 minutes. I'm very happy to have Professor Keating here and introduce him to you, and he can start this cafe.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate the invitation to be here this afternoon, and I appreciate seeing so many of you here for this topic that interests me a great deal, and it's good to see that there are others interested as well. It is, unfortunately, a most timely topic as well. As many of you may have heard, there was a UN Security Council resolution this morning with respect to Syria about whether or not there should be an intervention into Syria, and that resolution was vetoed by both Russia and China, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to this idea of responsibility to protect. So let me begin though by introducing what is meant by responsibility to protect, just in case it is somewhat unfamiliar to some of you. You need to go back a little more than 10 years to the year 2000, when the Canadian government established an international commission that kind of drew people from different parts of the world. It was co-chaired by a Somalian and an Australian, and this international commission investigated the issue of intervention in state sovereignty. And they came out with a report in December of 2001, and that report laid out what was referred to as the principle of responsibility to protect. Now, the principle of responsibility to protect was a principle designed to provide guidance to the international community, to states in the international community, about how they should respond to crises that were occurring within sovereign states. These crises could be crises created by civil war, they could be crises created by rebellions, they could be crises created by any number of political, social, economic upheavals that might be affecting a country. There's a bit of a debate about whether this would overlap with crises that were created by climatic change or natural events like tsunamis, earthquakes, and things of that sort, and that remains unresolved. But basically, the whole purpose behind this idea of responsibility to protect was laying out a principle that could guide the member states of the international system about when and where and how to intervene. There had been, during the 1990s, a number of interventions in places like Somalia, places like Haiti, places like the former Yugoslavia, in Iraq in the early 1990s as well, and finally in 1999 in Kosovo in the former Yugoslavia. And all of these interventions had been very contested amongst the states who were participating in them, amongst the people who were affected by them, and by scholars and observers, human rights observers and others around the world. And so the idea was to try and bring together a set of principles that would help to overcome some of these debates that were going on about how to deal with these sorts of conflicts that were occurring. And so the idea of, the concern was that there had been too much intervention and that this intervention was occurring without any clear set of principles attached to it. The responsibility to protect was an attempt to simplify this, and it comes down to kind of two basic principles. One is that the first and most important sort of shift was the principle that the state has the responsibility to protect its own citizens under all circumstances. Now this might sound, yes, of course they do, but it was different from the way in which sovereignty and state responsibility had been articulated in the past. In the past, states were allowed essentially to do whatever they wanted to do, and that's what sovereignty implied, that they were free from any sort of restraint, and they could behave in whatever way they wanted to, and this was to reflect the diversity that existed in the world and the respect the rights of states to have their own religion, have their own type of political system, have their own rules regarding the economy and other things. And it goes back to the establishment of states in the 17th century, where states wanted to practice their own religion and not be dictated to by the Roman Catholic Church. And that's why we had states created in Europe, so they could have that freedom to be different. And this was a group of Christian states at the time, but they wanted within their own different Christian traditions to be allowed to express those within their own political communities. And so we had this principle evolve where states were sovereign and could do whatever they want. By the responsibility to protect, we've actually introduced a variation on that, and quite a significant variation as it turns out, because we're now saying that states have to act in ways that are responsible to their citizens. That's all it said. It didn't really go further and to elaborate what that responsibility entailed. Did it mean that states had to be democratic? Did it mean that states had to engage in policies of equitable distribution of goods and services? Did it mean that states had to organize their economies in such a way? All of this was kind of left open, and it was simply states had a responsibility to look after their citizens. The second principle that was attached to the responsibility to protect was that if the state failed to exercise that responsibility, or if the state was incapable of exercising that responsibility, then the international community needed to take up that responsibility. And it was then the responsibility of the international community to protect the citizens of states that were incapable or unwilling to look after their own citizens. So this idea of responsibility to protect placed first and foremost the onus on the state to be responsible for how it's treated its citizens, but then to shift that onus of responsibility to the international community and to essentially obligate the international community to carry out that responsibility when states failed to do so. The principle itself it has, since it's been laid out in that original commission back in 2001, has been subjected to a considerable amount of debate and discussion, and we will continue that this afternoon. In terms of how the principle evolved, it was taken up by the United Nations in 2005, and at that time the United Nations unanimously approved the principle of responsibility to protect. But it began to, in a way, narrow the definition a bit. and it said that the state has the responsibility to protect its citizens from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or ethnic cleansing. And those are the explicit terms used in the UN. And all the member states of the United Nations agreed with that. But what it did is it began to kind of narrow, in certain respects, where that responsibility was to be applied to this select list of particular heinous crimes that might be committed within a particular state. So it began to exclude, for example, natural disasters as an area. It began to exclude certain economic practices. It began to exclude, in a general way, the whole question of human rights by narrowing it down to these 4 specific areas: genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, having said that, there are still many people who would like a much broader definition of what the state's responsibilities actually are. And so there continues to be pressure from human rights groups, from some Western governments and others to try and not only promote the principle, but essentially elaborate the principle to include more and more types of violations that might occur against citizens. But this is a very revolutionary principle as you think about it, and it's actually evolved very, very quickly in terms of international law or international norms. I mean, something that is just a little over 10 years old has been already partially adopted by the United Nations, and there are continuing discussions about if and how and where it should actually be implemented, which is a very, very quick adoption of a principle as far as the United Nations or the international community is concerned. Sometimes principles will take generations before they are kind of accepted into international law or practice to the extent that the responsibility to protect has been within the last decade. So it suggests the extent to which attitudes in the world have really changed quite significantly over the last 20 years in terms of our concern about what goes on in other countries and our willingness to interfere or intervene in what is going on in those other countries to try and right wrongs that we see or protect people at risk. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the concerns that have been generated by this principle of responsibility to protect. If we need to kind of go into more detail, I'm happy to do so if you have more questions about it or if different aspects of it come up for discussion. But setting that out as the principle now, what are some of the issues that come out of this principle and the extent to which it's been discussed and attempts have been made to apply it in the international system? Well, one of the concerns that has come out about the principle of responsibility to protect is the possibility that some more powerful states in the international community, the United States being the prime example, might use this principle to interfere in places where they disagree with the government in power, or where they have a particular interest that isn't being supported by the government in power. And so one of the concerns that some states have with responsibility to protect is that it could be abused, that it could become an excuse for intervention, and it could serve the interest of more powerful states in the international system. So that becomes one concern. Related to that, and a second concern, is that the responsibility to protect might prevent governments from pursuing alternative methods for organizing their political system, for operating their economy, and might be forced or coerced into adopting a more liberal political system, a more liberal view of human rights, and they don't have this kind of opportunity to be different or to express that difference in their political practices and the way they organize their governments. A third sort of concern is that the responsibility to protect might provide an invitation to those who might want to undertake a rebellion, a revolution, a forced change in the political process. That they might look at this principle and say, all we have to do is start some sort of instigation here, and the international community will come to our assistance if we begin to be oppressed in doing that. And so for some, there's a concern that it's really providing an invitation for minority groups or groups that are on the political opposition or the political margins in society to either take up arms or to engage in practices that are going to encourage a hostile response from the government and therefore generate an intervention on the part of the international community. So these are a few of the concerns. There are others as well that come out. One of the aspects in terms of trying to develop this principle of responsibility to protect is the issue of how it is to be implemented and what it is that the international community is expected to do. There's a general view within the document that the preference for implementing the responsibility to protect should lie with the United Nations. So the underlying assumption is that in determining whether or not the international community has the responsibility to respond to populations at risk, that responsibility should be determined by the United Nations. That within the United Nations Security Council, the discussion should be held, and if a decision is made to respond, then that's what would happen. There is, however, within the document, the provision that if the United Nations Security Council cannot agree, then it's up to other members of the international community to decide on their own if and when an intervention should occur, and if a responsibility to protect populations actually exists. So the document itself, the report, provides for the possibility that if there is not an agreement within the UN Security Council, then that shouldn't deter or prevent the other members of the international community who want to do something from doing it and from intervening in particular ways. The other sort of aspect, so that's an interesting argument, and it's an interesting idea that's worth sort of thinking about. The other piece of it, that in terms of how one should respond, there is an assumption that the response that one would make in undertaking this responsibility to protect populations at risk would start off with the most peaceful measures possible. That you start off trying to find peaceful ways of protecting those populations that might be at risk. And if you can't sort of protect them in those ways, then you move to ever more coercive measures, including potentially the use of military force. And so there is the provision within this proposal that you can use military force. It's acceptable to do so to protect populations at risk, but it should be your last resort. And it should only be undertaken if other measures have indeed failed. And so the debate or the discussion that sometimes goes on is, to what extent have other measures been attempted before pursuing the use of force in dealing with particular populations that might be at risk. And so that becomes another critical kind of conversation in determining how the international community should respond, and by what means, and when they should move from one means to another in terms of responding to populations at risk. So you have this sort of out there as what's intended to be the guiding principle, an attempt to try and clarify how the international community should or could respond to populations at risk. Number of sort of different dimensions to it in terms of how it actually gets applied. And I just want to sort of end by contrasting a couple cases and throwing out a couple of recent events. About a year ago, there were two cities, one in Libya and one in Syria, both about the size of Edmonton. And both of them were surrounded by hostile forces, government forces. And within both of these cities, there was a significant uprising in protest against the government and calls for the government to leave power and for a more democratic form of government to be established. In the case of Libya, the Security Council decided that the international community should respond to protect the people of that embattled city in Libya. And so the Security Council at that time voted in favor of establishing a no-fly zone to protect the population at risk in Libya. In the case of Syria, they did not do so. It never really got to the UN Security Council table. Too many issues at play, too many different interests involved. And so you had there a situation where both populations were probably at a similar level of risk, although one could make judgments. Gaddafi was saying things that were a little nastier than Assad was saying in terms of how he was going to treat the people who were opposing him. But at the same time, I mean, they were roughly two cities in a comparable situation, and on the one hand, the international community stepped in and said, we will respond. On the other hand, they just ignored it, or were unable to come to an agreement on how to respond. If you look at that and you think about that, what kind of problems does that present for this idea of responsibility to protect? The fact that it tends to be very selective in where it's going to be applied, or in how it's going to be applied. Whose populations are going to be protected, whose populations at risk are going to be ignored. And then just one final point. The UN Security Council resolution that allowed for the protection of the people in Libya provided for the establishment of what was called a no-fly zone. Essentially what they were doing was they were establishing the right of the international community to shoot down Libyan airplanes if those airplanes and helicopters were going to start bombing the city. And so the idea was that they would not allow the Libyan government to use all of the force available to it to punish the citizens that it was trying to punish. Instead, that operation quickly evolved into attacks against the Libyan government and the Libyan military. And very quickly, over a matter of months, what had become an agreement to protect civilians turned into a policy of eliminating the Gaddafi government. And that particular transition, without any further Security Council discussion, was one of the issues that encouraged both China and Russia this morning to say, we don't want that to happen again in Syria. And so we're not going to allow the United Nations to do anything to protect the populations in Syria, because we are concerned that if we say yes to this, then we might be leading into another Libya. And so there's a lot of interesting dimensions to responsibility to protect, and I very much look forward to your comments and questions as the rest of the afternoon. So thank you.
Right. This may not be loud enough.
No, I'll turn it up.
Yeah, turn it up. So we'll have a discussion now, and what we will try to do here is when somebody raises a theme for discussion, then we'll take first other people who want to respond to that theme before moving on to a new theme. So that will be the procedure we'll follow. All right, I see a gentleman here who wants to get in.
I didn't really want to rush to it, but Professor Keating, I wonder if you would comment on the need for the policy of might being right involved in these principles.
Just a little closer.
Oh, I'll repeat that.
Can you repeat yourself?
Sure. I wonder if you would comment on the need for might being right to be incorporated in the achievement of these principles that you enunciated. I think that could be useful for the discussion.
Are we going to do what you suggested, or should I just respond?
Respond.
Okay, all right. I think there is some validity to that. It's clearly a set of Western ideas and Western values that are embedded within the responsibility to protect. And it's also the case, however, that those values have proliferated. They've really spread throughout the global community quite extensively. But I think the problem with a right is might sort of approach to this is that it distorts whatever common underlying values might exist in support of it. And if one is to revert to a might is right approach, it would undermine the potential value of this initiative over the longer term. It is, however, a real danger, and it's certainly a widespread perception in its application thus far.
Does anybody else want to speak to this point about this turning into a might is right kind of proposal? You do?
Yeah, the fact that might is right
Keep it close.
is a fact. It's obvious when you list a whole lot of countries. You listed a whole lot of countries, where intervention should or has taken place, but did not mention the very obvious case of Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Might is right there. Why is it that no intervention takes place there when for 50 years there is an occupying power occupying the place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in addition to Gaza, there's many other parts around the world where one could argue there are much stronger reasons for intervention to protect populations at risk. I don't dispute that whatsoever. And it is one of the problems in the manner in which this principle is being applied. Because, again, getting back to the previous comment, you really, if you apply it in such a selective way that seems to be or is so blatantly representative of particular interest, then you do run into the problem of undermining whatever long-term viability it has. Let me, however, just, and I'll take the other comment, but let me just, however, throw it back a little bit to you. If you assume that you can never completely eliminate the interest of particular states in intervention and the responses that they take, does that then alternatively become a reason not to respond in any particular circumstance? So the fact that states are selective, where they have interest, they're going to intervene. Where they don't have interest, they're not going to intervene. That's going to be, in my view, a reality. That it will always, to some degree, be selective. How do you make it less selective is one issue. If it is always going to be selective, do you refuse to apply the principle in any circumstance? And I have mixed views about that, but anyway.
I was a child of World War II. I lived under Stalin and I lived under Hitler. Two evil regimes that had to be overthrown. It was selective that they were not overthrown until there was a war. So evil has to be fought, and then the question is, with what resources and when?
Does anybody else want to speak to this particular theme? Okay, I'll throw it open then to any topic.
Yes. I'm deeply committed to the principle of responsibility to protect. My question is, it is stated, first of all, peaceful means are to be used. And my question is, how do we decide when all peaceful or any means outside of military force have been exhausted? In Iraq and Afghanistan, I certainly don't believe that all peaceful, non-military means were exhausted. So that seems to me to be a huge question.
Absolutely. I don't dispute that at all, and I don't think that we have any instance, even if you look through the 1990s and all the interventions that occurred during the 1990s, in almost every instance there was an early use of force in the sense that other instruments had not been attempted to resolve these situations. And I would totally agree that that is what happened in Libya as well. and that it potentially could be happening in Syria, that we are really missing the opportunities to use the non-military instruments that might be available to us in order to respond to these crises.
Why are we missing them? Why are we missing them?
We're missing them because, well, these are probably more opinions than informed. I think we're missing them because there's a temptation out there that force is easy to use because of technology. And force also tends to, there's a lot of pressure to use force, especially in the United States. It's a very militarized society in terms of its foreign policy. It does not invest money in its diplomacy. It has sort of short-shrifted diplomacy for years. It's short-shrifted development for years, and it's invested all of its money primarily in the military as the principal instrument of its foreign policy. And so when you look at what's available to use, there's a tendency for to the extent that the United States is involved, to resort to the early use of force because it's one of the few instruments that available to it. And so I think that becomes part of the difficulty. And technology makes it, as I said, easier to use. You can drop bombs from 15,000 feet. You don't have to get your feet dirty or anything else. And now with unmanned drones, you don't even need personnel to actually do it. So that makes it another temptation to use. So I think those are parts of the reasons why. And also because we haven't turned as much as we could, maybe to the role of various non-governmental groups and tried to bring them into implementing a policy of looking for alternatives to the early use of force. But I think since the 90s, we've seen it's become much easier, much more tempting, and hence much more frequently that force has been used in response to these situations.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? Right.
Yes, I'd be interested to know what your opinion was of the intervention of the Arab League into Syria's problems.
I'm reluctant to say too much because I don't know as much about the circumstances that surrounded their efforts. There's a lot of debate about whether they pursued their efforts as seriously as they might have done. There are suggestions that they maybe pulled out too soon. There is also some debate about who instigated some of the acts of violence against the Arab League observers. There are some who were saying that some of these things were instigated by those on the rebel side, some on the government side, so there's a little bit of a debate about that. My own view is that it was probably too little and it was too short-term, and that a better effort might have been made, if not by the Arab League, perhaps the Arab League, in working with non-Arab League partners, and I don't mean the Americans, I mean non-Arab League partners from the South or from Northern Europe or other places, that might have provided a longer-term effort to assess what was really going on and the best ways of helping populations on the ground in Syria. So, a little reluctant to say because of the kind of mixed views about what actually happened there. And it did strike me as relatively short in terms of their efforts, in terms of trying to get. I know they made an effort, and I mean they were placed in some very difficult situations. So one can appreciate why they pulled out as quickly as they did, in some respects. But at the same time, I think it's a little bit still confusing about what actually happened with that mission, to be able to determine it fully.
Right.
I was wondering about the business of the counting the dead. I heard this morning on CBC that they're going to, the UN is going to stop counting the dead. And one thing I was thinking, is theoretically, we have all these satellites up there. And theoretically, they can take the license number off a car. Surely, looking down to see what's going on and how many people may actually, wind up on the ground, there might be more possibility for this.
One would think so, but counting the dead is a very political activity. And it doesn't matter how, it's not a question of information really, and being able, it's a question of how that information is used, who collects it, who reports it. And if you go to any major conflict or humanitarian emergency, the counting of the dead is very, very, very politicized. And it's politicized by everyone, by governments, by opposition groups, by humanitarian NGOs. And there have been many, many studies that talk about the way in which the counting of the dead has been abused, or the counting of populations at risk have been abused. And it's because it's so political. The more dead there are, the better for your group to gain money, or for your group to gain international support. Or the fewer the dead they are, the more easy it is for a government to claim it's not a big deal. So it becomes very problematic, and gaining access to the sorts of information that you speak of is not available to unbiased sources. So while certain Western governments might have satellites that allow them to do that, their willingness to use that satellite in a manner that is unbiased, or to provide unbiased information to United Nations or regional organizations, just isn't there. And so there is no, I mean, the best we can do is the international bodies that are around. Some of them are NGOs, some of them are UN organizations, but even those have political interests that one needs to be aware of in assessing how they use the reporting of casualties.
Just really quickly to respond to that, your point is well made there, because in the question of Iraq, for example, we have estimates, the minimal estimate I think is 100,000 Iraqi casualties, whereas the Lancet and Mark Herald from New Hampshire, as you know, has put it up to close to 1 million. I just had two very quick observations to make, actually, one negative and one attempting to be positive. The negative is that, in my jaundiced opinion, the United States in particular, but many of the Western European countries, because of their colonial and neo-colonial past, and this is an observation which many people make, have lost virtually any moral authority to act as global police officers. I mean, the United States history of intervention and regime change in South America, in Iran during the 1950s, and most recently in Afghanistan and Iraq, speaks volumes not only about its neo-colonial propensity to involve itself where it thinks it has strategic interests, but more, I think, the amount of money which is made in the armaments and defense industry, and really kind of brings us back to Eisenhower's gloomy prophecy about the military-industrial complex. So, my negative concern is that the Western powers in general, particularly those with a long colonial legacy, can't be trusted to set the ground rules for this kind of international policing operation. They have too much at stake. Their interests are too greedy and too selfish, and their interests are also too short-term. So when we talk about responsibility to protect, this is always seen as a military undertaking for the most part, whereas I think a real responsibility to protect would involve a long-term concern about other aspects of human security, which will be food and shelter, and clean neighbourhoods, an investment which will be long-term and ongoing. And if that investment were made on a continuous basis, it would probably prevent the rise of many of the conflicts that we see and we will see over things like water. So I don't want to be long-winded, but trying to be positive, my second point is the problem kind of just forgetting about the anti-imperialist politics for a moment, just for a moment, the problem I have with the responsibility to protect is that it's seen as a highly centralized policing operation. And I think we have something to learn from criminologists recently who have kind of compared traditional centralized policing operations with new experiments in community policing. And I think there is something to learn here because there are parallels and analogies. And we know from available research on community policing that police officers who get out of their patrol cars, who do not simply respond to concerns about crime, who spend a long time embedding themselves in the community, develop community contacts, and develop resources within the community, they not only are more effective in crime prevention rather than simply crime control, but they also energize those communities themselves to begin to create local infrastructures which create possibilities for reducing crime as well. So I don't want to be long-winded about this either, but there is, I think, an analogy to be made here, that we should be thinking, first of all, longer-term investments in human security more broadly defined, and secondly, community policing, which in terms of the global situation, it might mean what the South Africans tried to do in Zimbabwe. I mean, at least they constructed a short-term alliance with Changarai, and the president of Zimbabwe, I'm not even sure. I think that broke down, so they may not. Vietnam going into Cambodia, which at least put an end to the Khmer Rouge, or India going into Bangladesh. I mean, these are local attempts to try and deal with regional conflicts on a regional basis without invoking the superpowers, without invoking the neo-colonial powers. So that would be my idea of community policing.
Do you want to respond to that, Tom?
Sure. I think it's a really interesting analogy, the community policing analogy, and the trying to increase the ability of more local actors to respond to these situations is, I think, a very, very important one, and one that I think, I mean, talking about like the missed opportunities, one of the missed opportunities in Libya was the African Union's effort to try to establish a ceasefire negotiation between the Libyan government and the National Transitional Council there. So I think that's a very good analogy. One of the things I didn't mention, and it's indicative of how this whole responsibility to protect has evolved, is that there are two other pieces to the document that the authors included alongside responsibility to protect. Those were a responsibility to prevent and a responsibility to rebuild. And so they saw this more as a more comprehensive approach. And the prevention piece is important because what is often lost sight of as we talk about how to respond to populations at risk is deeper thought about how those populations came to be at risk in their particular societies, and the extent to which we, speaking broadly of the West, have had some role to play in placing them in those positions. And one of the things, as I speak often about responsibility to protect, I'm not sure where I stand yet on responsibility to protect, but as I speak more often about it, I mean, I realize that one of the things that's totally ignored as we talk about responding to these crises is a closer examination of where the crisis came from. And we need to do a lot more of that in order to be better able to prevent those crises from occurring elsewhere or recurring in those own societies. And that means doing more than just development policy. It also means thinking about how some of our own practices, current practices around investment, around trade and distortions of trade, around the supply of military goods and hardware in these situations, is creating crises 10, 20 years into the future.
Anybody else on that direct topic?
Just on when you mentioned about sort of moral authority, to me that speaks to a right to intervene as opposed to a moral obligation. So you would see as the West may not have the moral authority or the right based on their history, but based on their wealth, based on their ability to intervene, do they have a responsibility? And how often in the interventions is it the sense of obligation, and how often is it used as a right toward their own advantage, their own? So to me, if it was seen as I have a responsibility as opposed to a right, so that would be one comment. The other thing that was raised, and spoke to some of it, but what are the other means that are available other than military, and what are the pros and cons of them? Like there would be sanctions. Are there other means that need to be developed? I think the idea of the policing or the community policing, but what are some of the other, because I don't think we're very strong at it, and what should be developed as more quiver, or arrows in the quiver in order of...
Right. On the first point about the right to intervention and the responsibility, one of what was happening during the 1990s was that much of the discussion about responding to these crises, these conflicts, these emergencies, was referred to as a right of intervention. We have the right to intervene. And that was always the case for the more powerful states who had that right. And it was actually a French foreign minister who was originally the founder of Médecins Sans Frontières and went into politics and became the French foreign minister. He was the one who really articulated this principle most strongly in talking about the right of the West to intervene, to redress the wrongs that were going on in these other societies. It was concern about the way in which that was being used and abused that encouraged the commissioners to drop that and said, we're not talking about a right to intervention, we're talking about a responsibility here. And the responsibility, they says, lies first and foremost with the government in power locally. It's their responsibility to exercise. We should do everything we can to help them exercise that responsibility. But if they fail to do it, then the international community must assume that responsibility. So that whole effort to shift it to a discussion of responsibility was partly an effort to talk about it in terms of both the individuals who were at risk and who was going to protect those individuals. So it was an attempt really to change the whole dialogue or discourse around intervention that led to the commission and resulted in this kind of different phrasing, so that we would now no longer speak of rights to intervene. It was protection, which was a critical component of it, and responsibility being the other piece of it. In terms of what other instruments are available, well, I mean, I think if you go back to, say, the resolution in Libya, the establishment of a no-fly zone was simply an effort to do that. So you take away the advantage of the government. That's not military as such. It just means that if they want to put their planes in the air, you will interfere with those planes getting there. So that, yeah, I mean, it is military, but it's not bombing of citizens or installations. And then what you're doing is you're trying to provide a more equal battleground. That doesn't resolve the conflict, but it resolves the oppressor from using instruments at their advantage. Other things, though, that could be done. Yes, sanctions could be done. The adoption of conditionalities, like in addition to sanctions, so you make conditional responses, conditional support based on changing of behavior. You stop doing this, then we'll do this to provide you with assistance. That's what's been used in Korea for years. North Korea, like if you stop developing your weapons, then we'll give you food. We'll let you talk to the rest of the world and things like this. In Kosovo in 1999, before they started dropping bombs, there were human rights watchers, human rights observers who were integrated into the community coming out of the European Council on Security and Cooperation and Development. I got the name wrong of that, but yeah. But coming out of Europe, there was this team of human rights observers who were in there. That becomes a little more difficult in conflict situations, but not impossible, because you could provide protection to human rights observers within these zones to provide them with a greater degree of opportunity. I mean, this gets back to the Arab League discussion, where it becomes a little bit uncertain how much international support and protection those observers had as they were going in trying to determine what was going on. It doesn't appear to have been a lot, and so it was either ill-planned or badly supported. But it seems to me that did provide an opportunity, a better opportunity, and it just either didn't get enough support or was not given enough time to maybe do things. The whole idea of mediation and of trying to mediate between parties. Sometimes that's not easy to do because of the intransigent position of the parties. But I think there are different instruments that are available. Some are being tried, and some are being done in a preventive way. There's the case of Kenya. After the last general elections in Kenya, there was a brief flurry of violence over the contested elections. Everyone feared that that was going to really deteriorate into a major ethnic conflict in Kenya. But there was very quick intervention by the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and a team of regional diplomats who went into Kenya, brought the opposition party together with the different ethnic communities, and quickly quelled what could have been a very, very serious conflict in what otherwise was a stable society. So there are these things that sometimes we don't always hear when prevention works because nothing has happened. But there are other instruments that are available.
Tom, I was wondering, it often strikes me when a new principle is promulgated, we have a habit of thinking that that principle sort of hangs there in the air and functions almost at times without context. My sense is that a new principle requires the development of a kind of culture of understanding, culture of interpretation associated with it. Now, if you agree with me, do you see, or can you say anything about how that might begin to, or even over the last 10 years, how you begin to see that sort of texture developing? I think of Tony's comment here in reference to this. I mean, it seems extravagant to suggest, but perhaps it's imaginable that part of that culture that will develop will take the shape of the major nations which have deep vested interests actually learning to step aside, and the local nations, nations that have another kind of relationship to that place, coming into the forefront and acting.
I think I agree with the premise that that's absolutely essential to enable a principle to really take root and to change behaviors over the long term in significant ways. And one of the dangers I think we are experiencing with this idea of responsibility to protect and all that's kind of attached to it is the danger that it does get too quickly taken up by the more powerful, by the West, and it becomes more specifically linked to particular interest or infected by those interests. And especially when those states or those more powerful interests have abused the principle, have used it in ways that it was never intended to be used. And there was a lot of discussion in the Iraq War in 2003 by Tony Blair specifically, less so Bush, but by Blair specifically, that they were protecting Iraqis. And that this was analogous to the responsibility. It had nothing to do with responsibility to protect. And to try and say it did, really undermined that all those efforts being made to try and develop this culture. setting that aside for a minute, and that's been really problematic, and it's really made it difficult, I think, to advance the principle and to see how deeply the principle is embedded in this broader culture. I think there is, at the same time, however, a much broader concern with the phenomena that is sometimes referred to as human security. And I think we have seen over the last 20 years throughout the globe a much stronger sense of concern about human security, very, very broadly defined. Not in terms of human rights or civil and political liberties necessarily, but in terms of how individuals live and experience life on this planet, in terms of their access to food, to water, to a clean environment, and to all these things. And so I think there has been really positive signs of the importance of human security, the priority that should be given to human security, and to some extent this has kind of been pushed on to governments' plates as a responsibility that they have. It's going to look different in different parts of the world, and they're going to respond to threats to human security differently. And so that's why you have to be careful. And this idea about community policing, and that does make an interesting analogy, because it can't be put in place from the top down. You can't kind of just articulate the principle and then go around saying, this is how it corresponds to our value system, so this is how we're going to try and implement in different parts of the world. That would be totally counterproductive and would undermine the underlying set of values that are being represented in that principle. You have to allow the local communities to define it in their own ways, and you have to give them the opportunity to be able to express that in their own ways. Now that might be kind of messy, and it might not always go in a kind of a linear, progressive direction, but unless you allow that to happen, you're not going to get a sustainable sort of commitment or operationalization of those values in different communities. This is one of the difficulties, I think, with responsibility to protect. If that too easily falls on the international community, and the international community takes up that too quickly in some situations, then you really undermine the ability of the local population to sort things out themselves and to come to their own resolution about how they are going to live with each other and support each other in a common community. And if you, to the extent that you interfere with that, or there's a perception that that could be interfered with easily, you undermine the incentive to do that as well. I talked about the fact that some rebel groups are instigating things. Well, I mean, if you know that the Americans are going to start dropping bombs on your opposition, if you make things look bad enough, if your death count's high enough, then what's your incentive to try and find common ground to work together in that particular community? It's totally, in a way, undermined by that.
Just following up on that, I know a little bit about the Kosovo situation. That really struck me at the time. I spent a little bit of time there just before we started dropping bombs on it. And it plays to one of the concerns that you also said existed. The net result of two things there. One is when you impose sanctions, you also limit your knowledge. So the West, frankly, I think, didn't know what the hell was going on there. Or they only knew little pieces of the puzzle. Just little pieces of the puzzle. So sanctions have this problem built into them. The place of knowledge in all this, and local knowledge, is enormous. And it seems to me we've not given it very much attention. So in Kosovo, I mean, the net result of that has been ethnic cleansing. But not ethnic cleansing of the Kosovars, of the ones we bombed. It's amazing.
I mean, Kosovo, 12 years after the war, 3 years after Kosovo is an independent state, I believe there are still more NATO troops per population in Kosovo than there are in Afghanistan.
I think I'd like to put in well, maybe I actually want to go out on a limb here. I'm very Westphalian about all these questions, and the business of military intervention, I think the possibilities for things going wrong when you intervene militarily are almost always underestimated. And so that even though a situation may be very bad, as it is indeed in Syria right now, and I have very little sympathy for the Assad regime, I have no confidence whatsoever that a foreign military intervention would make things any better. I mean, it could lead to all sorts of extra violence, and once foreign troops get involved in the country, this always creates all sorts of animosities, not only in that country but elsewhere, and can upset the rather finely balanced network of relationships that exist in that area of the world, even more than they already are. So I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I would agree that military intervention is always very unpredictable. You just never know what's going to happen, and even with the technology and the precision of the technology, it's still highly unpredictable in terms of the effects of the use of military force, and then the political repercussions are profound and also frequently unpredictable. The authors of the document Responsibility to Protect, the ones who laid out the principle, argued that if and when military force were to be used, that it should try to adhere to just war principles. And in other words, they should take into account all of these things. But we all know that trying to apply those just war principles, especially trying to determine proportionality, is very, very problematic in terms of trying to sort out what's going to happen when you begin shooting. You just don't know. And so yes, it does really create a high degree of uncertainty, not only for the country, as you say, but for the region surrounding the country. And the more volatile the region, in a place like Syria, the more problematic it potentially can be.
Anybody else, or maybe
There's one up here.
Oh, I say sorry.
Well, David mentioned that the principle seemed to hang in the air when it appeared, but I wonder if that's really true. I wonder if there isn't some kind of natural law theory that would go back further, that perhaps was applied in some other way, and might even afford some guidance in the way the principle of a responsibility to protect is used. Would you like to comment on that?
A little louder.
I'm inquiring about the origins of the responsibility to protect, whether they may not go back to natural law theories. Whether natural law theories are too distinctively European to fly in other parts of the world is another question, but I'd just like to investigate the origins of the principle.
I would like to hear more from you about what you think about that, actually. There has been some sort of previous efforts to establish the standards that states should adhere to in order to call themselves states. And throughout, like from Westphalia on, there were all these efforts to determine what characteristics a group of people living within a particular territory needed to demonstrate in order to qualify as states. And that, for the most part, disqualified everyone who wasn't European. And it was only really as you begin to move into the 19th century that they begin to accept things like racial equality, for example, as allowable in order to allow Japan to enter, quote-unquote, the international system of states. And there were, during the 19th century, late 19th century, efforts to establish in a more sort of regulated way these standards, they were referred to as standards of civilization, is the term that was often used, and asking states or peoples to adhere to these standards in order to qualify as human beings who would deserve human rights, or entities who were acceptable under international law. So in the practice, certainly there is that. In the philosophy, I'll defer to others in the audience, much more informed than myself. One of the interesting developments in the 20th century, at the time of there's this wave of decolonization that takes place around the world in the 1950s and 1960s, where many of the countries in the global south acquire their independence from Britain, from France, from Belgium. Portugal was a little more of a struggle, but from all the European colonial powers. And the United Nations adopted a resolution at that time that essentially affirmed the right of colonial peoples for independence, to become states. And it was a very interesting phrase that they said, that neither the lack of education, economic capacity, military capacity, or sound government should stand in the way of a state becoming independent. So the entire opposite of this idea of responsibility, in a way, that this UN declaration said, that the fact that you used to be a colony really was all that you needed to demonstrate in order to become a state. So the international system had, in a way, moved away from all these efforts to develop standards into a situation where they did not want any standards to apply, because they were concerned that they would be Western standards. And the Western standards would be imposed on these countries, and they would be prohibited from acquiring their independence unless they adhere to these Western standards of governance, of politics, of economy. And so they refused to accept those and said there will be no standards at all. And now what we've come to with responsibility to protect is an attempt to kind of reintroduce standards and to say, well, you're not a legitimate state unless you're protecting your citizens. I mean, that's kind of implied there, because you open yourself up to be controlled or interfered with by others unless you act responsibly towards your citizens. So we are indeed coming back to bringing standards in. The hope would be that in doing that, we are reflecting, as David was suggesting, a broader culture, a broader kind of set of values that are shared throughout the world at large, and not just our own views about what's important and what states should need to do. And that's the dilemma, as to whether that actually is taking place. And again, I have mixed views.
I'd just like to, in a sense, briefly agree with Martin when he talks about the problems involved in military action and their unforeseeable consequences. There is something very irrevocable about killing somebody. And the problem I have with the responsibility to protect as a centralized doctrine is that it really has a tendency to demonize certain governments and certain ways of life, certain cultures for that matter. Ways of life and cultures which are often very different from our own and may in fact violate what we hold to be some of our most cherished beliefs. But what bothers me is military actions going into these areas are so insensitive quite often to the local cultural norms, beliefs and expectations. Like the Bedouin Code or the Pashtun-Wali, I think it's called, are very harsh systems according to our Western perspective. But they've grown up in mountainous or desert regions. They have very strong norms of loyalty and of retribution. And if we kill members, if NATO forces kill Pashtun warriors or Bedouin warriors, these are very cohesive societies. And we should not be surprised if they have a long-term hatred of our actions in those parts of the world, which go several generations. There are some accounts I've heard in Afghanistan that some of the Pashtun warriors believe that the reason the British troops were in Afghanistan is to revenge the death of British soldiers who were there in the 19th century. I mean, these guys have long memories. And so I guess what I'm saying is a centralized version of a policing action tends to demonize societies and governments. We may I mean, the killings in Syria right now are horrific. There's no two ways about that. But quite frankly, I don't know what proportion of the population in Syria supports Assad and what proportion is already in opposition to it. If it's a civil war, then we are joining on one side or another of a civil war. And we're joining a country, Syria, which has a long history of standing by itself against local opinion. It's a country which still insists on the return of the Golan Heights. It was a country which has always refused to accept the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan and those neighbouring countries because it has upheld the importance of the Palestinian question. So we're not dealing with a country which is going to fold over quickly. The Syrian government has a long history of standing up to its convictions, even if we at the present find those obnoxious in many ways. So the problem of demonization and of killing, it sets off problems which can last for generations.
Absolutely. The responding difficulty is the extent to which outsiders, specifically us in the West, stand by and watch these people destroy each other, or take innocent lives in part of that conflict. And so, I agree with you. I mean, then that's the real dilemma. What do you do standing? And I mentioned this to my students. They said, well, you can't just stand by. You can't just do nothing if there's some way you can go in and help alleviate some of the suffering in that conflict. The dilemma that's posed is how do you alleviate that suffering while allowing that local resolution to take place? And that's the real, I think, critical point that we haven't gotten to in thinking about how we exercise our responsibility. How do we protect those populations who are indeed at risk? I mean, the concern at Benghazi in Libya last year at this time was that Gaddafi was going to go in and slaughter 500,000 people. Because he said he was. He said he was going to go door to door and take them out one by one and da-da-da-da-da. And so he was making all these comments. And so for the West to kind of, or for outsiders to kind of say, well, gee, can we let him do that and just stand by when we've been told he's going to do that, when we can see that that's happening, when we're being alerted to that possibility? I'm not saying the response was the appropriate one, but it's that dilemma. So how then do you intervene in that place? Clearly it's a civil war. Clearly there is contest between the different communities there, and yet how do you go in a way that protects the population that's at risk without undermining the possibility of the two conflicting parties to come to some sort of resolution on their own? And clearly we couldn't do that. Clearly the way we went in, the way the Canada and others went in was to destroy the Gaddafi regime and give, at least over the short term, a degree of power to the National Transitional Council. And if we look at how they've used that, we say, oh my God, is this what we've created? Because they haven't always, they're turning around and having the same sort of torture and other practices that we thought we were getting rid of. So agreed, it's a real, it's a real dilemma in terms of what you do in those circumstances. Because the easy answer is just stay out of it. But that becomes unconscionable to many when they see some opportunity maybe to go in ways that might be helpful.
The idea that the values underlying the responsibility to protect are largely an expression of Western values and not necessarily universal. I think we should explore that more deeply. It seems to me that the Arab Spring and other movements where significant proportions of populations have turned against their rulers and have demonstrated a thirst for, however they understand freedom and democracy. It demonstrates to me that some of these Western values are or have the potential of being embraced universally. So I think it's too easy to dismiss this as all an expression of Western values. Perhaps some of these Western values are deeply embedded in human nature. Could you respond to that?
Quite possibly, and that's what I was suggesting, that if we had made sure that there was this opportunity for these to be expressed locally, then let's allow that to happen. And it indeed might clearly demonstrate that these are more universal and are not exclusively Western. And the measure in that will be the willingness and ability to do that, to allow them to express themselves. So, for example, if Arab Springs results in a whole range of Islamic governments exercising Sharia law, we need to be able to say, yes, that's the expression of those people, and not to be overly, critical of that choice on the part of those people. So I think that, and I think there is some indication within this whole discussion of the responsibility to protect that this does have some support. It's not people being totally rejecting this as a Western idea. So the responsibility to protect does have support. Even people, even the leaders of Russia and China who are opposing it have made some really interesting comments about how there are aspects of the principle that they do very much support. What they're concerned about is where it's being implemented, how it's being implemented, who is implementing it, and what the repercussions of that are. So there is something, I think, at play here that does reflect a more universal set of values. They might not be as Western as we would like them to be, and so we need to be willing to live with them if they take a different turn.
I think maybe we'll call a intermission here, and for about 20 minutes, and everybody can refresh their drinks, think about what's been said, and then maybe frame some new questions or new comments to make on this really very involved topic. Okay, so 20 minutes. Here, who has the first question or comment to make?
Thank you, Martin. I want to bring up a number of things, starting off with some of the things that were brought up. One is the four-letter word we use very often, and it's derivative, the word called West. What does it mean? Myself and Nick were discussing it. We agreed that it wasn't geographical because it didn't include Aboriginal people, for instance, in both Australia and Canada. So where does that come in? That leads on to the other trope, which has a lot of traction these days in what you're saying. It's called the white man's burden. It was very popular at one time, and it's interesting how it's come up again in all this responsibility to protect. So West, white man's burden. And I want to go back a little. While you were talking, I thought of King Arthur and the legend of the Round Table and all these knights who used to go around the country rescuing all these ravishing damsels in distress. Merlin, of course, fits in, the Excalibur fits in, and it all seems very appropriate to talk about this at this particular point in time. How is it that, the same knights have been reincarnated over time in Europe and now are reincarnated in the effort to protect, of course, to get all the oil, but effort to protect all these Muslim women from Muslim ogres? It's very much part of the agenda, which is unspoken, but nonetheless there. So these 3 or 4 things that sort of, going on in my head, I would approach it from a literary point of view rather than a political point of view, but nonetheless, it makes a lot of sense. The trope of the white man's burden is very relevant, and why is it so?
Does anybody else want to chime in on that? Right.
What I'm going to say may be considered rather provocative, but I think what we're struggling with is the concept of us and them, which is inherent in human behavior. And how do we then define us? How do we define them? If we're talking, there have been times in history, and there are still groups of people who, if you go to the utter extreme, and don't take me wrongly here, if we go to look at animals living in the wild who would want to intervene in the cruelty of one animal killing another for its territory, that's the absolute extreme. I'm not suggesting that. But I think we have to very carefully look at how much of this is what we consider of us and how much is them, and are they part of us or are they not part of us?
Any other people want to.
Thank you. I thought about the apparent negative things we've arrived at from these principles. And the positive thing, one of the positive things that came was the Western values. I'm in two minds about that, whether I agree or don't agree. I think history will make it clear, but I do know that the West praised Gaddafi and the President of Egypt and the President of Syria for too many decades to suddenly change their mind without a reason. That reason hasn't been made, but I'm sure those Arabs are thinking about it. I would prefer then to say, if we looked at this from a different point of view, if I put myself in the shoes of a bully, then I want to try and improve things. The first thing I believe I would need was a very large and well-defined conscience. Is there any evidence in the history, the past history, say of 10, 20, 30, 50 years, where we can say that that has happened in the West?
Still other people, yes.
In terms of the West and the East, or them and us, I was wondering, this automatically leads, I think, to the idea of when we're going to have the world government. And it seems to me that in terms of having somebody that could possibly be the least affected by all these regional, local, national, etc. interests, some form of world government which would have an independent, or as much as possible with humans, an independent jurisdiction, source of enforcement, might well be the only future answer we have. And in terms of Tony's comments about a local area being more capable or more able to look after itself, the analogy would be that of a family. If you consider the Arab area as a family, I think it's families that have the most difficult time in terms of dealing with each other, on a reasonable level. And so, the local policing or the local enforcement may not be as effective as the world government.
Any further comments before I go to Tom to see what he has to say on all this? Did I miss anybody? Okay, Tom, how do you react to all
I'm
that?
not sure that's enough time to think, too. Let me say a couple of things by way of trying to get at some of these issues. I think it's instructive that this kind of practice of intervention and this debate about intervention really takes on steam at the end of the Cold War. At a time when there were a number of people in the West, and Francis Fukuyama kind of represented that view, that somehow the end of the Cold War represented the victory of American liberal capitalism, I think is probably the crudest way of putting it, that this was kind of the confirmation that the ideas that had been embedded in post-war American political and economic practices had been successful and had demonstrated their effectiveness in comparison with rival ideas and systems and things of this sort, which I don't agree with, but that view really took hold, and you had this kind of development of a number of democratic governments coming out of this, and all this concern about liberal democracy became quite prevalent, and in many, like the international regional organizations began to adopt liberal democratic principles, and everyone began to fly the liberal democratic flag in Eastern Europe and different places. And so that became kind of the measure of one's acceptability or legitimacy within this international community. And you did that in part because you were under considerable economic pressure to conform to around those norms and practices. Now, I mean, whether they're Western and to what extent they're Western is a really contestable point. I think it is open to debate about whether this is sort of a set of Western values, but they're projected as such because to the extent that they are being imposed or invested in other countries, a lot of it comes from Western powers most recently. And if you look historically at the state system, a lot of these values and practices came out of that European tradition. And getting back to the earlier comment I made, where there were efforts to try and require states to fulfill those in the past that had been abandoned as a result of decolonization. I think part of what happens during the 20th century is the realization that we are not all the same, that we are different, and let's try to find ways to accept those differences and live with those differences. And whether or not we've done that right, I mean, one of the ways we did that was by creating these states that allowed people to be different and giving these states the opportunity to develop differently, different political systems, different economic systems. Well, as you move into the latter part of the 20th century, that pressure has tended to go the other way, and the pressure has been to make them more alike than allowing for the difference. And there's been a lot of pressure, and it started with economic pressure because there wanted to be similar economic systems around the world so that capitalists could make money wherever they went. And then it extended into the political realm where you needed the political system to kind of match or seemingly support that economic system because it was too selfish to do it just on economic terms. We had to kind of think about it in terms of human rights and democracy. And so this became the big push to try to make everyone look similar and behave in similar ways. And I think one of the real dangers that comes out of that kind of latter 20th century, very late 20th century, and as we go through the early 2000s, is the continuing pressure for conformity around many of these principles and practices, because we are doing so against the reality of difference, and we are also doing so in a way that makes that difference a point of conflict rather than something to be appreciated and enriching for all of us to live in a world that is so different. And that's why, whether we call these Western, some of them are Western, some of these practices are clearly Western. We talk about competitive party systems and regular elections and peaceful, some of them are not, though. That doesn't mean that human dignity is a Western concept. It doesn't mean that preventing people from being victims of systematic and discriminatory abuse isn't, is a Western concept. I mean, some of these are universal, and the problem is that they get collate, they get converged into similar things, and so we have a situation where the measure of one's legitimacy as a government is now built around these Western liberal economic political values rather than reflecting these more universal concerns. And people who don't support those, people who organize differently, who have a different culture, are less tolerated now, where there's less willingness to accept those differences and to try and live with those differences in our current system. Now, whether that's primarily because of some of the economic engines of globalization, whether that is because of the sheer political and military power of the US and a few of its allies, I'm not completely sure. I think it's probably a combination of both. I don't think it's sustainable. It will not continue. And the question is, how do we get to this more pluralist world in which we live as peacefully as possible? I think the responsibility to protect kind of along the way potentially becomes a negative influence to the extent that it allows those who are in positions of power now to enforce their way of life on others. It need not work that way. It could work much more positively as kind of a set of principles that allow different communities to, as someone mentioned to me at the break, encourage governments to look after their citizens more effectively in their own ways. In that first element of responsibility to protect, that the state has the responsibility to protect its citizens, if we could drive that home more strongly and allow more states the opportunity to do that, then we might be able to get away from being in positions of feeling we need to intervene because we don't like what's going on, or it offends us to see dead people lying in streets of foreign countries. I don't know if that completely addressed, so I'm going to turn things back to people because I think I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there, so I want to make sure that others have a chance to come back at me because I think I missed things too.
Okay, I have a profound skepticism on whatever you've said up to this point, because I find we started from the beginning, and we have a declaration that we are sort of innocent. Let us assume is a good declaration, but then we have different standard to apply the declaration. If it comes to one concern, we go in and we'll do something. If it comes to somebody else, we will look the other way. And I bring it back to say, I'm walking down the street and I see somebody abusing a third party, and I myself think I should intervene because that is my way of looking at things. But then the first thing I do, I have to decide, well, do I have a big stick or a big gun or whatever to what are my interests in the situation and so on. So from a point of view of intervention, I end up doing nothing because of a variety of reasons. So what I'm saying is, why do I have this set of rules if I'm willing to throw them away anytime that is inconvenient for me? And looking at our past history and our, by saying our, I mean the world way of looking at things, I find that I have no ground to stand on legally, morally, for this manifesto that I put on the wall. It's basically whitewashing all the junk that is behind, well, economical, political, or whatever. So I find I'm actually getting more upset by the minute because I think this is just a waste of time.
Coming back to the idea of language and my literary approach is that this whole thing about responsibility to protect needs to change. The whole idea of the responsibility to protect, the language needs to change. It's a language which, as you pointed out earlier, the U.S. foreign policy is completely militaristic. The whole economy is militaristic. Canada seems to follow suit for some odd reason right now. I don't know why. But how is it that we can get to a language which is different, which can allow, as the gentleman said, and Tony said up earlier, is to allow us to speak a peaceful language or a peacemaking language? Not in the sense that you send out warriors or soldiers to make peace, but how is it that the very language, for example, it's okay for some countries to talk about intervening, but how about Canada and the U.S. look at their own countries and look at the history of the Aboriginal people? What if another country like China, say Japan or India, decided that they have a responsibility to intervene up here because of the history of the Aboriginal people? Is that right or wrong? They can't do it, of course, because they don't have the power to do it. They don't have the weapons to do it. So where is it that we can come up? Or for instance, another, the whole idea of right now bombing Iran. Where is that coming from? Where is the responsibility to protect when when this kind of war talk is going on? So where is it that we can find language which will change this, which will undermine and change the language which we're using? I think that's what I was trying to get to in my earlier question when I talked about raising the West or other things.
Do you find the very words responsibility to protect sort of what? Tendentious, misleading?
Well, it depends on the context. Like everything else, it depends upon the context. The words cannot be used out of their context. As Thomas was pointing out, when he started on this lecture about responsibility to protect, he used certain instances, he used certain examples as to where it was imperative that we do so. How about, it's like, the question that I asked was if China or India or Japan or, I don't know, any other country decided that they're responsible to protect Aboriginal people in Canada or the US, where does that lead us? If not more war. It's not that these countries are any more peaceful. That's not what I'm saying. They're just as belligerent. For example, India has 500,000 troops in Kashmir. How is it that they can have such a large occupying state? Or China or Japan, for example, they have their own histories. How do we turn around and get a completely different kind of language in diplomacy, for instance? And are there traditions which we can search apart from the West, which may have such traditions, or including the West, which may have certain traditions of peacefulness, of talking peacefully to each other, so that the outcome is not war. The outcome is not killing, as Tony pointed out. That's about the worst thing that we can do. And yet we seem to jump into it by the first available means. The war with Libya, for instance, it was obviously about oil right from the word go. Everything else was just, hogwash. Who doesn't know that? Let me leave it at that.
I'm just going to jump off that comment about language, because I think for me, the very words responsibility to protect instantly evokes a hierarchy. Someone needs to protect and the other one needs protection. So built into that word is this inequality. It's kind of, I need protection and you're going to protect me. There's no way to, I almost think it's like a parent, the one who decides I'm going to protect my children. So therefore the other person who needs protection, just by that word, it implies this inequality and that one is doing the protecting. And for me, I find the language of human rights more generally much more compelling and much more, I don't know if that gets to what Shamas was asking for in terms of trying to find a peacemaking language, but I guess that's where the term itself and the language, it seems to imply that.
Yeah, I think these are really good questions, actually, very important ones. And I think my brief conclusion on this is firstly, I tend to see the United States right now as one of the greatest obstructions to the dissemination of greater social justice and human rights. And I think that's partly because there's such a huge aegis of hypocrisy that lies over its long-term foreign policy, because the US has never had any difficulty coexisting with authoritarian or even totalitarian regimes if they served its geopolitical purposes. I mean, Saddam Hussein was America's man for the longest time. When he went to battle with the Ayatollah Khomeini, he had Rumsfeld going in there with botulism spores and God knows what else. So hypocrisy is a huge problem. But in answer to your question and Jonas's question, the big problem is that I don't think there is a very good, viable, practical example. And the one I'm about to pick is probably full of holes. But the thing about the European Union And the thing about the European Constitution, which actually my country rejected a few years ago, Ireland voted against it, but that's another question. The thing about the Constitution is that it does provide an idea, if it's not a perfect template, of developing, shall we say, a free trade area, which unfortunately discriminates against the global south, which is very unfortunate, but and is unjust. But it provides a constitutional possibility for countries who seek to enter into that and to become members of the European Union, and we could conceive of a broader version of that, that countries will begin to adjust their human rights practices in order to conform to the expectations of the larger community. And in the long term, I could see a kind of more globalized version of the European Union as maybe beginning to form a template. It would provide opportunities for countries to end the long-term discrimination against their products if they try to adjust to the prevailing norms that most of us believe are regular human rights. So, but in a sense, I'm pessimistic because the United States is an empire in decline, and empires in decline historically have taken the most extreme forms to try and restore their power and influence in the world, including, in this case, remaking the Middle East according to its own expectations and interests. And there's tremendous dangers involved in that. On the one hand, the declining US, the other hand, the rise of India and China, and with the potential conflicts. So if ever there was a need for a globalized, not world government, that's a different concept, but a globalized constitution to which all countries could aspire to enter on the basis of some general definition of good behavior, that's the most I could see.
I think again we're talking about the fact that the human animal is, in its broadest sense, it doesn't matter which, us, them, whoever, is a rather territorial animal and a very aggressive animal. And by nature, it doesn't matter whether it's the US, it's territorial, aggressive, whether it's any of the Middle Eastern countries, whether it's China, it's Russia. There's that same thread. This is the nature of the human animal. What I think you're suggesting is that if we try and make a large enough tribe, essentially, to include everybody, there will not be that feeling so much of us and them that they are marginalized or thought less of, because by its very nature, as I said before, us will always fight them. That's the nature of the human being, I'm afraid. So the idea, ideally, and I'm pessimistic too, ideally we will be able to include everybody. That's not going to happen. And if you look in the history, it's this particular time in history when the US is perhaps declining, but it's been, and we've had the British, the Europeans, but there have been times when other parts of the world have been at their height. And in the full history of human beings, there will be other human tribes that will assume supremacy. That's again the nature of what happens.
I'm in favor of I'm drawn to the idea of the responsibility to protect, because it's getting away from a right to a responsibility. And one of my interests in coming to this type of talk is it informs me on how I should live, and how I live within my family, how I live within my workplace, how I fit into the country, I see a lot of parallels. So I feel a fairly keen responsibility to protect when I look at my children. If I were walking along the street and I saw somebody being hurt. So I think there are lots of examples where it can go wrong, but that sense of responsibility to protect, I think, is tapping into something that we all feel. The comment about responsibility setting up an authority or a hierarchy, I think at times that's because you have the ability. If you have the means to help the poor, there is a hierarchy, just a practical. You have the means, they don't. And I don't think that's a bad thing to have that sense of responsibility. But I think there are principles that when you intervene, you know, when I think of that we need to get better at, we need to learn. So if I think of my kids fighting, there are times to let kids figure out, solve their own problems. But there is a point when they may seriously hurt each other that I need to step in. And there's no clear lines. There are times when you might intervene at the wrong time, but there is a time to let them sort out, to give them the tools to sort their own problems, but there are times that you need to step in. I think that one principle that isn't applied very well in the bigger picture comes back to the comment about knowledge of the situation. You can't care for something unless you understand it. You can't care for a horse unless you know about horses. And so when you intervene, it should be because you care, it should be, it can't be self-serving, and you must understand the situation in order to have any sense of possibility of correcting the situation. So if my children are fighting, I may need to step in to separate them, but then it's incumbent on me to figure out what they're fighting about. If I step in with which I've done lots, thinking, you know, one side is right, the other side is wrong, I often, you know, can create more harm. But I think that's something that we need to learn. You know, I've learned as a parent that, you know, to jump to conclusions, to jump in thinking I knew all the answers, can lead to more harm. So I think we need to get better. We need to have knowledge on the ground. We need to, but I think it's tapping into a deep sense that if we can, you know, stop a wrong, then shouldn't we try? Shouldn't we try to do it better, avoid the pitfalls, but shouldn't we try?
Now, there's a philosophical question. Are we obligated to stop wrongs? Tom, do you want to comment on all this? We've had quite
I'll try a little bit. I mean, these are very good comments, and I share many of the concerns and pessimism that some of you shared. So let me just say a couple of things, and then maybe get back to this idea of language, because obviously part of this is about the language we use to describe what's going on. One of the traditional sort of practices that they tried to embed in the international system was non-intervention. So that's really where we wanted to start from, or the international community wanted to start from, that whatever went on within the state was not of concern to anyone else anywhere, regardless of what it was. And that had been the long-standing assumption. Now, it was often violated, you know, and there were all sorts of interventions when that took place, but it was possible to condemn those, to you know, rail against those, because they were a violation of this kind of fundamental underlying principle that you don't intervene in the domestic affairs of a state. And that's embedded within the United Nations Charter and in the charter of many regional organizations, that you don't intervene. One of the things that changes in the 1990s is a change to the right to intervene. It kind of, you have almost the reversal, that there now begins to open the door that you have the right, without real clarity around what would allow you to exercise that right. But there was an attempt to kind of change the underlying principle from one of no intervention whatsoever to the right to intervene when you thought, as an actor, something was going wrong, which only rewarded power, because we all know that only the powerful had the right to do that, or would have the opportunity to do that. So whenever they thought something was going wrong, then you had the intervention. That's what many people, the authors of this report, were most concerned about when you talk about, you know, the disparity of power. There wasn't a human right to protection. There wasn't a human right to security. There was instead a right for the powerful to step in if and when they wanted to. And so it was an attempt to kind of alter that discourse, alter that language which had crept into international practice. And there were two ways of going. One was to revert back to non-intervention and say, let's really stick to this non-intervention. By that time, members of the international community, broadly, including those in the global south as well as those in the global north, were unwilling to go there. They thought, no, we've come to recognize that we share a lot, despite our differences. We do share a certain commitment to sort of this common humanity and to trying to protect it. A lot of it comes out of the human rights discourse and the universalization, or the attempt to apply universally what that human rights principles meant. And so they turned it into the individual has a right to be protected. I mean, it's really what they were talking about. And that right and that responsibility to protect those individuals lies first and foremost with the state. So it was an attempt to kind of change that discourse that this group was involved in. The problem of hypocrisy is riddled throughout the international system and international history. And it doesn't matter where you lie. It's true of powerful, it's true of less powerful. And everyone is hypocritical, partly because, in my view, everyone is motivated by a variety of concerns and a variety of interests. And anytime you put forward one, you're being a hypocrite because you've also got something else in your pocket that you're concerned about. You know, yes, we're there to protect the Libyans. Well, we'll get a little oil on the side too. You know, but if you said we're there to get the oil, but you're also got a few people, we really want to help these people who are in danger. So you're always getting mixed motives, and we can always say, well, these were the most important, otherwise they would go here and they wouldn't go there, and that's true. But so you're never going to get away from hypocrisy. So the question is, can you work with it, and what can you do with it in a constructive way, I think. So if we are all going to be hypocrites in one way or another because we're all operating with mixed motives, then we have to figure out, can we get around that, or do we just then go back to non-intervention and say, we're all different, we can't reconcile these differences, we can't do anything to help each other, so we allow each state to do what they want to do. Maybe so. I'm not ruling that out, and oftentimes when I think about this, I said, well, maybe that is the best. But it becomes more difficult to follow that principle of non-intervention when we turn on the television at night. Or when we have widespread personal or economic or social connections to people in these other communities who may be suffering. And that might create economic problems for us as a result of globalization, but it also creates personal problems because of connections that we have increasingly in this more globalized world. So part of the question is, how do you grapple with those kind of persistent dilemmas of always going to be conflicting interests, hence always a degree of hypocrisy, a seeming inability in our contemporary system to turn away and just allow things to run their course, even though sometimes that might not be a bad way for things to go. But it could be quite brutal, and the question is, do you want to sit back and watch that, and for how long, and at what cost? So that's worth thinking about, in terms of our ability to sustain that. I wanted to mention something else, though, because we had this conversation about, what level of government and how do you get people to buy into different principles. One of, I think, the positive outcomes of a lot of this is that a number of regional organizations are actually adopting some of these principles. I mean, there is a provision actually within the United Nations Charter that you should be a good sport, essentially. I mean, you should be a good state. You should behave according to the principles that we enshrine in the UN Charter. So according to that, your membership is supposed to be based on your willingness to act properly. That doesn't happen, we know that. But what we are finding and the European Union was pointed out as an institution that's embedded this kind of this rights and allows membership on the basis of rights. Well, it's really interesting that other regional organizations are beginning to adopt similar types of human rights conventions and requiring their members to sign on to those and beginning to talk about their members who don't respond favorably to those human rights commitments. The Latin Americans have done that in their regional organization. The Africans have now done that in their regional organization. And so you find in those places that there now is some institution, there's some regional commitment. So in Africa, for example, it's not a declaration of human rights, it's a declaration of human rights and peoples. So they respect individual rights, but they also respect the collective rights of some indigenous communities, some tribal communities within Africa, and accept the right for those people to maybe act in ways that don't protect individual rights. So we do see some indication that there is a movement to trying to put these rights forward, trying to put them forward in a context that makes sense to local communities, and they're going to be different, but in a way that will encourage the members of those organizations to respond to those. So, you know, I'm pessimistic about the responsibility to protect working well, effectively, but I think what it's done is it's generated a discussion and an effort to try to find ways to make governments more responsible, to afford citizens a higher degree of protection, and setting aside all the other problems that exist with it. It's maybe at that level that we really look to see what effect it can play in bringing about more positive change in how people treat each other.
And with that, I think I'll draw this discussion to a conclusion. We have to end a little bit early today. So it's a kind of modified optimism, qualified optimism, that out of this stew of hypocrisy, greed, and special interests, some sort of progress might emerge. And so let me thank Tom Keating so much for talking to us about this, shedding so much light on these questions. And I also want to thank the staff of Steeps for hosting the cafe. And remind you that we'll be holding another cafe in 2 weeks' time, same place, and I hope to see you all then. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.